culture. Donald Trump is also a racist. And so, of course, Donald Trump's public comment about Roseanne's racist outburst includes absolutely no objection about Roseanne's overt public racism.
The left takes the idiotic words of one person and blames it on millions. So it's no more about Roseanne's awful tweet. It's about the left expanding the tweet to the president and, by connection, half of America.
Why are some journalists blaming Roseanne's racist tweet about Valerie Jarrett on the president? Why didn't he denounce it? And is there a media double standard when Samantha Bee uses the C word to slime Ivanka Trump?
Put on something tight and low cut and tell your father to stop it.
We just saw Roseanne's show canceled after the comments she made. But for Samantha Bee, an apology, that's good enough. No problem.
The president calls for TBS to fire Samantha Bee, but some liberals are defending the comedian. President Trump accuses the media of a disinformation campaign. That's right. Says Robert Mueller is meddling in the midterms and that he never should have hired Jeff Sessions. All of it triggering a partisan crossfire.
President Trump continued his lie-packed crusade against the law enforcement investigation. Today he stated that it's actually special counsel Robert Mueller who will be guilty of election interference. You heard that right. Not Putin, Mueller.
This would actually be a crime, and to suggest that the Mueller-led investigation would amount to meddling is beyond fantasy. It's Trumpian projection.
I think it's so cute that this president thinks that attorney generals are supposed to be their personal lawyers. And by cute, I mean completely ignorant.
But on the issue of Trump wanting Sessions to unrecuse himself, that doesn't surprise me at all. I don't find that surprising that if he told his White House counsel, this is ridiculous.
Plus, the New York Times obtains a leaked Trump team legal memo telling Bob Mueller the president can't be guilty of obstruction because he can fire anyone. Is this a leak designed to win the PR war? I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. Roseanne Barr was riding on top of the world with a big hit show before her spectacular self-immolation with a racist tweet against Valerie Jarrett, that one linking her to Planet of the Apes, that prompted ABC to cancel her rebooted sitcom.
I'm worried about all the people out there who don't have a circle of friends and followers who come right to their defense.
President Trump made no comment about the tweet, but added to the media uproar by posting this about Bob Iger, the CEO of parent company Disney. Bob Iger of ABC called Valerie Jarrett to let her know that ABC does not tolerate comments like those made by Roseanne Barr. Gee, he never called President Donald J. Trump to apologize for the horrible statements made and said about me on ABC. Maybe I just didn't get the call? Joining us now to analyze the coverage of all of this, Katie Pavlich, editor of Town Hall and a Fox News contributor. Susan Frischio, chief congressional correspondent for the Washington Examiner. And Capri Cafaro, a former Democratic senator in Ohio who teaches at American University. Katie Pavlich, so Roseanne fires off this horrible racist tweet. ABC axes the show. And the president had nothing to do with it other than he liked the show and he called Roseanne to congratulate her on her ratings. And you have some liberal anchors like Don Lemon using that to say, oh, the president is even more of a racist.
Yeah, I find that interesting because when we had the congressional baseball shooting about a year ago, the man who carried that horrific event out was a Bernie Sanders supporter. He volunteered for his campaign and was an Occupy Wall Street attendee. And yet you didn't see the right jump to the conclusion that Bernie Sanders was responsible for the attempted assassination of Republicans on a baseball field. I find it interesting that the rest of what Roseanne's show represented is being ignored when it comes to this conversation. Roseanne herself in her personal life is a Trump supporter. She played one on the show. However, the rest of her show was actually very diverse. You had the transgendered son, you had the African-American granddaughter who has an African-American mother in the military, the feminist sister who supports Hillary Clinton. And so I find it disappointing that all Trump supporters and the president himself are being blamed for a comment that was put on Twitter when, I'm sure we'll get to it, the Samantha Bee situation was a line that was put into a teleprompter approved by producers and network and said on television.
And we will get to that, but let me pick it up with Capri because some other pundits are saying, well, actually, Trump is to blame for the Roseanne tweet because he created the atmosphere that tolerates racism. Again, this is Roseanne Barr using a Planet of the Apes reference. The president didn't have anything to do with that.
Look, I mean, I think that the narrative and the hypothesis that, President Trump somehow has, ignited this racist kind of trend to come out into the forefront, into the mainstream, that is nothing new. I mean, but, he did not put...
Nothing new, but is it fair?
No, I mean, no, in this context for sure, because Roseanne Barr did what Roseanne Barr is going to do. There's nothing new about Roseanne actually saying things that are controversial or, potentially insensitive or whatever you want to say. What happened in this particular context, though, is because President Trump did not respond, did not explicitly say it was racist, and even Sarah Sanders just said it was unacceptable or inappropriate. I think that is what the more liberal media latched onto, saying, well, if you're silent about this, you must be complicit in it. And I think that's a bit of a stretch.
Let me just look at Roseanne and ABC for a moment. So first she said it was a joke, and then she said she was on Ambien, and then she said, well, it's really my fault. What I did was so egregious and unforgivable. No one should defend it. But given her history of ugliness and racism and spewing conspiracy theories on Twitter, didn't ABC executives know exactly what they were getting?
I just think they're naive. I think they're naive to the intersection of television and social media. It's just the Wild West on Twitter right now. There are no editors. There's no one to look at in the old days, the stars were managed. Their public appearances were managed. Right. Now you have Twitter. I don't think these big media companies are really setting standards. They're setting standards as they go. They're playing reactionary to all this. They're saying, oh my God, what are we going to do about this tweet? Well, we just got to cancel the show. I mean, it was all so crazy the way the whole thing evolved. You have to admit, just so sudden. But they don't have the standards in place.
Katie, you mentioned Samantha Bee, using the C word and making these other scurrilous allegations about Ivanka Trump. And then you have some in the media saying, well, it wasn't really so bad, or, Trump uses worse language against women. So again, making it about the president because of what a comedian said about his daughter.
If we ever put the shoe on the other foot when it came to what Samantha Bee said about Ivanka Trump, all hell would have broken loose in the media, and for good reason.
At Michelle Obama
or Chelsea Clinton. Can you imagine if this was aimed at Chelsea Clinton? It would have been horrible. We should have condemned it. Samantha Bee issued an apology, but she is still being kept at the network. The network itself said that it was their bad, and yet she's still being kept at the network. We're seeing this double standard also play out at MSNBC right now with Joy Reid, who had horrible blog posts in her early career about anti-Semitism, saying that John McCain was just like the Virginia Tech shooter, photoshopping him. And again, it goes back to the double standard of how conservative women are treated in the media, how liberal women are treated, and how executives on the left handle it because they believe in the things that Samantha Bee is doing overall and in the policies that she opposes that are coming out of the Trump administration. And therefore, an apology is good enough for Samantha Bee. It's certainly not good enough for Roseanne Barr.
I actually read something interesting about this, and I don't necessarily agree with the hypothesis. I think it's all vile, and I think that it is sad that this is the world that we live in right now. But Entertainment Weekly, which is not necessarily always in my rotation, but they did an interesting analysis on this issue, basically saying that TBS could not necessarily fire Samantha Bee in the same way that ABC fired Roseanne because they were complicit in what happened, that they basically signed off on it, and because of that, they didn't have the credibility to can Samantha Bee. I mean, that's an interesting argument. You can't use the same for Joy Reid, certainly, but I think that the fact that we're actually having this conversation shows how divisive the country has gotten and how both the left and the right seem incapable at this point to have any consensus and common decency, and I think this is what we're seeing here.
Now, Susan, nobody would suggest the president is a model of etiquette. He can fight pretty hard. But when his daughter was slimed, for some commentators, as long as Ivanka Trump is the target, because somehow she's enabling all these terrible policies, anything goes. I mean, this kind of language and this kind of sexual crack has been used against her before by Bill Maher and others. Now, the president's calling for Samantha Bee to be fired. It doesn't look like that's going to happen, but it does seem like there's a different standard for going after the president's family.
There's a different standard, I think, and it's not so much based on Trump and the fact that, well, he sets the tone, as I think Chuck Todd said in a recent interview, that the president establishes tone. If he was a Democrat and he was putting forward a Democratic agenda with Democratic policies, I really don't think anyone would care very much about that tone. Suddenly, I think that it would be okay for him to be hard on the media or hard on whoever his political enemies are. I feel like this is given the press and the people who are liberal license to go after the president over his policies under the guise of him being this brute on Twitter. And so just try to reverse it. I always just play the black and white game. If this was a Democrat, would the same thing have evolved? I don't think so.
By the way, CNN's Michael Smerconish yesterday did something I thought was really egregious. He put up a tweet, it's by Sally Field, that actually spelled out the C word twice. I mean, everyone's saying this is so terrible, so terrible. And on a Saturday morning, you're putting it out there, and you had a guest using the S word as well. So I thought that was not classy. And by the way, you'll notice with all these kinds of attacks, Ivanka Trump has not responded. She does not respond. She does not get out down the dirt despite the terrible name calling and scapegoating that goes on against her. And I think that's worth pointing out. All right, lead story in today's New York Times, big exclusive that everybody is following, has to do with a leaked 20-page letter from the Trump legal team to Bob Mueller, essentially making the case that the president can't be guilty of obstruction of justice because he has the power to fire anybody. He could fire Comey, he could fire Mueller if he wants to, and also perhaps therefore he doesn't need to testify. Katie, the instant media take here is the president, with this argument by his lawyers, is trying to put himself above the law. Is that a reasonable, at least, argument for a journalist to make?
If you're an attorney and a journalist, I think that maybe you can make that argument. For those who are not, maybe you should just report on the memo and let the chips fall where they may. But if you look at the memo, this reminds me of in May when we saw this leaking of the questions by someone, whether it was the White House legal team or someone else, detailing the questions that Robert Mueller was supposedly going to ask the president. This memo, when you read through it, makes it very clear that the Trump legal team is saying, we have answered all of your questions. We have given you all of the documents. Here are the details about the conversations that you want to know about and ask the president about. There's no need for you to sit down with him because we've already answered those questions. And so I have a hunch that this leaking came from the legal team again as a PR play to get ahead of the Mueller investigation, to show everybody in a transparent way that they have done their part to answer the questions ahead of time, so that the president does not sit down with Robert Mueller, as the legal team is saying he will not. They can justify it by saying, look, this is what we did ahead of it. There was no need to sit down with.
Which is very interesting, Susan, because the president was on Twitter complaining about the leak.
Who leaked it?
Well, you know, Mueller's office has been pretty leak-free. It probably was somebody on the Trump side. I'm speculating here to some degree. But also, isn't this part, Rudy Giuliani was on 2 Sunday shows today making the same arguments that was in this letter, isn't it part of an aggressive strategy to try to win the PR battle in case the president decides not to testify or to go to court over it?
And it's the most important battle for the president, because you win the PR battle, you get out in front of this whole impeachment threat, because people in Congress listen. They pay very close attention to what the public thinks. So, yeah, absolutely. I think that's clearly what he's doing.
And even though the president does, it's true, he has the executive authority to fire anybody, but if there is obstruction, I'm not saying there is, it has to turn on criminal intent. Therefore, Mueller can make the argument that he needs an interview.
And finding intent is actually very difficult to find. But
right. So do you think that these leaks are helping the president politically, or is it all just the fog of war now?
I don't think that this leak, is actually going to win the PR war, because what it does is it plays in again to this narrative that President Trump thinks he's above the law. The New York Times, at least online for this piece, actually annotated all 20 pages with a very sort of explicit footnotes and everything else showing what they trying to basically make the point that the president is showing that he's above the law. That is not helpful. That's also showing a bias from the New York Times, but not helpful for the PR battle.
Well, also not the last word on this long-running test of wills between the two sides. All right, ahead, more on some pundits actually defending Samantha Bee for sliming Ivanka, and perhaps a double standard for some other liberal commentators we'll get into. But when we come back, more on the president versus the press on the rush. Other liars. The president tweeting this week that the fake mainstream media during the campaign ran the most highly sophisticated and dishonest disinformation campaign in the history of politics. And Katie, he also responded to that New York Times story saying that the president had privately pressed Jeff Sessions to reverse his recusal on the Russia probe by saying, I now wish I'd never hired him. You said versions of that before. And the media really pounced on the president for tweeting that Bob Mueller is meddling in the midterms without offering any evidence. Fair criticism or not?
Well, I guess it depends what your definition of meddling is, but it is true that Robert Mueller's investigation will have an impact on the midterm elections in terms of what people see in the news, what they think about the administration. Is there corruption involved? Is there obstruction of justice involved? So I think that is certainly fair. When it comes to the president's tweets about the mainstream media, it's interesting because the mainstream media, let's not forget, propped Donald Trump up during the primary, and as soon as he won the GOP nomination, went all out on him and hasn't stopped since. And so it's interesting interesting to see that dynamic continue to play out between the president and the
Might
press.
be some dispute on the propping up. But on Mueller, so Rudy Giuliani goes out there and says, well, he really should wrap this up by September 1st. And Mueller's not going to let Rudy dictate the deadline. And so is that meddling just because he continues the investigation because he's not done? Is that meddling in politics?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you got to do your job. And I think, as Katie said, I mean, it's about what your definition of quote unquote meddling is. I think that part of I would assume, my analysis of the President Trump's tweet is that he's trying to say if there is a poor outcome for the 2018 election for the Republicans, then this is a factor, and therefore it's not necessarily him, it's not necessarily, the GOP, it's Mueller's meddling.
So a little advance explanation. All right, so let me put another tweet up for you, Susan, on the screen. The corrupt mainstream media working overtime, not to mention the infiltration of people, spies, parentheses, informants, into my campaign. Surveillance much? So the problem with this is that the FBI informant story was broken by the New York Times, and there have been endless stories and segments about it, but not necessarily casting it as spying, which is the president's preferred term.
That's such a hot debate right now. Was it a spy, or, the way I see it is a paid informant working for the FBI who was spying on the Trump campaign? And you can word it whatever way you want. I don't think that's an illegitimate. I think the president is doing what he often does, which is labeling something. He puts a name on it and he sticks with it and he identifies it as something positive or negative, depending on exactly how he wants to cast it. Puts it out there, and that helps with his narrative.
All right, here's one for you, Katie. Everybody gets a tweet on this panel. President saying, by the way, I never fired James Comey because of Russia! Exclamation point. The corrupt mainstream media loves to keep pushing that narrative, but they know it's not true. And of course, the media response is, hey, you sat down with NBC's Lester Holt days after the firing. You said you fired him regardless of recommendation from Ron Rosenstein. The quote was, I said to myself, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. And that's sort of part of the press critique of this president, that he contradicts himself.
Yeah, I mean, his words are on tape in that interview, so it's clear when he admits in this interview that that was part of the factor. Now, also in that interview, he talks about the frustration that James Comey wouldn't publicly say that the FBI was not going after him directly, and that all in terms of the Russia investigation, and therefore that was part of the Russia decision that was made in terms of James Comey. But the thing that they have to focus on is he has the right as the president of the United States of America to fire whoever he wants at any time, and that leaked memo that we just discussed actually details that argument in full.
A pretty brief response on any of this.
It gives me a headache, to be honest. It gives me a headache. I'm sick of it, and I think America's sick of it too.
So you were just like shutting down the Twitter, forget about it.
Pretty much.
Before we go, during the break, you mentioned that you and Roseanne have gotten into it online on Twitter. What happened?
I think a few years ago when Roseanne Barr was heavily involved in the Occupy Wall Street movement, she blocked me on Twitter.
Yeah.
This week, I was tweeting about her show. She unblocked me, retweeted me, responded to me twice, and then reblocked me. So
Roseanne Barr paid a lot of attention to Fox News' Katie Pavlich.
Block me. We can have a conversation.
Great discussion, guys. Capri Cafaro, Susan Frischio, and Katie Pavlich. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Ahead, MSNBC's Joy Reid apologizes again for old posts that aren't just homophobic, but cast her as a 9/11 truther. Yet the network says she's grown and evolved, so it's okay. But up next, some rare praise for Fox News just because the news division covers Donald Trump fairly. Of the mainstream media, they prefer to poke at the caricature of Fox, reducing it to a handful of opinion shows that are largely sympathetic to President Trump. But Fox has a thriving news division that tries to report fairly on the president, say, on his battle with Bob Mueller. And that is generating some chatter. Here's a Washington Post story. On Fox News, of all places, Trump's spy claim is debunked by Trey Gowdy and even Judge Napolitano. Got that? Fox News, of all places. Andrew Napolitano challenged the president's contention that the Obama administration deliberately spied on his campaign after GOP Congressman Trey Gowdy told Martha MacCallum the FBI acted properly.
The allegations by Mayor Giuliani over the weekend, which would lead us to believe that the Trump people think that the FBI had an undercover agent who inveigled his way into the campaign and was there as a spy on the campaign, seem to be baseless. There's no evidence for that whatsoever.
Damn. Even people on Fox News are calling Trump out for this one.
Now, that's the judge's view, and there's no shortage of Fox commentators supporting the president's Spygate charge. Shepard Smith sometimes tries to debunk the president's claims, and that's what drew plaudits on MSNBC's Morning Joe.
Here is a clip of Shep Smith, superstar, soon to be a musical.
Love him. President Trump accusing the special counsel and his team of a whole new set of conspiracy theories. Unfounded, not based in fact or reason, with no evidence to support them.
Fox News. I mean, Judge Napolitano, Fox News' news gathering force. Again,
specifically
doing what I will say, doing what I thought Republicans always did, and that is stand up and defend the rule of law, stand up and defend the FBI.
It's no surprise that Joe and Mika, who become fierce Trump critics, would single out Fox segments that support their views. But on Fox, there are also these very different views.
It was Comey leaks because he wanted a special counsel based on a phony dossier. They actually spied on him. Then he hires a bunch of Democrats.
Robert Mueller's out-of-control Russia probe has now lost any sense of legitimacy.
Now, obviously, the president watches plenty of Fox and does most of his interviews with Fox, but if you look at the whole picture, it really undermines the narrative that Fox News is some kind of monolith. Ahead on Media Buzz, the president has Kim Kardashian to the White House and a CNN report uproar over Roseanne's racist tweet. The media have been far more restrained over another outrage. Samantha Bee, the host of Full Frontal on TBS, went off on the president's daughter, as you know, for the sin of posting a picture with her child with the worst word in the English language that you can use against a woman.
You know, Ivanka, that's a beautiful photo of you and your child, but let me just say, one mother to another, do something about your dad's immigration practices, you feckless. He listens to you. Put on something tight and low cut and tell your father to stop it.
After the White House denounced her, Bee said this on Twitter: "I'd like to sincerely apologize to Ivanka Trump and to my viewers for using an expletive on my show to describe her last night. It was inappropriate and inexcusable. I crossed a line and I deeply regret it." Joining us now, Emily Jashinsky, commentary writer for the Washington Examiner, and Richard Fowler, radio talk show host and Fox News contributor. Emily, until the White House denounced Sam Bee's language as vicious and vile, I read all the media reports on this. They were all like, wow, did you see what Sam said? Not reaching the Roseanne level of outrage until maybe later.
Some of the initial media reports were almost like, in some of the liberal outlets, were almost applauding her, like, oh, this is kind of funny. And so that was really interesting. And I actually don't think, I'm glad you played the second part of that clip, because most people stopped it after she used that word. Yes. And it goes on to get, I mean, I think also very inappropriate. And so what's interesting about all of this is I don't think Samantha Bee would have ever had to apologize. I don't think we would still be talking about this. I certainly don't think she would have had the will to apologize if it hadn't happened in such proximity to the Roseanne Barr incident.
Which actually makes it all the more, I guess stupid would be the right word, to do that and do it in a pre-taped segment. And by the way, you know, they were initially proud of it. The executive producer, Miles Kahn, wrote, "So, feckless C word seems to be trending." Now, some others have announced it, CNN's Brooke Baldwin and others, but do you think she would still be employed if she had used that awful word against, I don't know, Michelle Obama?
Well, I mean, I think this is, the word is vile, right? Let's start there. And, and I think what makes it even more interesting is I think you're right, Howard, in that the only reason why we're having this conversation about Samantha Bee is because it happened so close to Roseanne, which has allowed conservatives to point to this double standard. But I don't think you can conflate the two cases, and the Roseanne case in particular. And if you talk to folks at ABC, they would tell you that Roseanne, not only does she have a history of bad behavior, but since getting the show, she has been warned about her behavior over and over and over again. So this is like sort of the third strike for Roseanne, which allowed them to say, you're out the door. In Samantha Bee's situation, is her language vile? Absolutely. But the case is different here because we don't know what is happening between her and the TBS executives. But is it vile? Is it wrong? Is there a double standard that the conservatives can point to? I think there might be here.
I agree that they're different. But I also think that lets Samantha Bee off the hook. And especially you pointed to the second part where she says, put on something tight and low cut and tell your father to change his effing immigration policy. That is the same low blow that Bill Maher did a few while back about joking about an incestuous relationship. And somehow, like, it's okay to do that to the president's daughter?
Yeah, actually, none of this was a dramatic departure from the way a lot of liberals in the media talk about the relationship between Ivanka and Donald Trump. And so I do think that these are not apples to apples. I think what Roseanne said absolutely was worse. But in the same way, they are different because what Samantha Bee said went through layers of bureaucracy. It was written down. It was very much premeditated, which makes it very different in another way as well.
All right. Let me move on to the case of Joy Reid, MSNBC weekend host, and she had already apologized for some decade-old posts on her blog that were very, very homophobic. I mean, really offensively homophobic. And now she's apologized again, among other things. She seems to be have been years ago a 9/11 truther. She was promoting an Alex Jones film, charging that the 9/11 attacks were carried out by the U.S. government. Richard?
I mean, I think the blog post is pretty insane. Here's my thought on this particular case. I do believe that everybody has a past, and everybody's past is murky, depending upon how you spin it or how you look at it. I do believe that Joy should have a chance to explain herself, but I do think that the rope here is running a little short, and she's running out of rope, and so I think she's got to explain herself pretty quickly to the Americans.
But on that point, she did again apologize online, but said nothing on her show yesterday about this. She certainly had that platform, and let's put up a picture that she had posted. It was a Photoshop thing involving John McCain, sort of grafted onto the Virginia Tech shooter. And so MSNBC says in a statement, well, some of this is hateful, but she's grown and evolved. No real accountability. It's a long time ago, but there's so much of it, Emily.
Yes. And at first, I was willing to give her the benefit of the doubt and say, you have evolved. We should absolutely have room for that. It's been more than 10 years in some of these cases, but it's turned out to be so much. And the worst part, and what I cannot wrap my head around, is the fact that she pretty much clearly fabricated a cover-up story about hackers, and she's supposed to be a journalist, and MSNBC is running ads touting her as one of their stars, one of their star journalists, and still hasn't gotten around
even
that.
You would probably say that if somebody had said half of this stuff who worked for a conservative news organization, there would be a far bigger uproar than there's been about Joy Reid.
Well, let me say this from a broader context. I think we're currently living in a society where it's become so tit for tat that is like everybody deserves. It's like almost like Oprah, but instead of like handing out cards or handing out red slips, like you get fired, everybody gets fired.
Well, there's a lot of bad stuff going on in the culture.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we've got to at some point in our country and in our culture, we've got to come to this point of reckoning that says what's fireable and what's not fireable, because now it's become on the left and on the right. It's you're fired. We want somebody fired. And everybody's getting fired.
It's sort of up
we're not really sure why.
to the news organization involved. But when President Trump says Disney has a double standard because it did fire Roseanne on its ABC unit, ESPN, which is owned by Disney, took no action against Jemele Hill, the sportscaster, when she called Donald Trump a white supremacist. And then Keith Olbermann has just been given an expanded role on ESPN. Here is just some of what he has said about the president.
Trump is indeed effing crazy. As mindless and as evil as the baboon's policy is, it can and will be rolled back sooner or later. Congenital disease, drug use, any of a dozen post-concussion traumas, Alzheimer's, senility.
Now, Olbermann didn't say this on ESPN, but that's okay with Bob Iger, and Olbermann gets a bigger role on the sports network?
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with this larger point about partisan bloodthirst and the tit-for-tat bat. I definitely agree with that. But if what Joy Reid has done is not, when we're trying to find this line as to what's fireable, if that's not fireable, what is? I mean.
But Olbermann, who used to command a big audience on MSNBC, he's called Trump a Nazi and a traitor, and it doesn't seem to hurt his career.
Well, I mean, listen, I think Keith Olbermann is problematic. I think that language is problematic. But I really feel as though, and going back to my previous point, is we as a country have to figure out, one, we've got to bring civility back. I think it's somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean right now.
All right, I'm good on that. But you can't impose a standard because every media organization has to search its conscience.
Absolutely.
When a star does this.
And how are we supposed to get back to civility when Samantha Bee is getting awards for advancing social causes? I mean, she got an award the other night, and she accepted it for advancing.
I think she's sorry for the word, but I don't think she's sorry for the sentiment involved, and I think that's troubling. Great discussion. Richard Fowler, Emily Jashinsky. There's a lot more reporting on pundits and comedians sliming Ivanka, by the way. My book, Media Madness, Donald Trump, the Press, and the War Over the Truth. I really go into it. Coming up, we'll look at the coverage as the North Korea summit is back on. Plus, the president's Friday, the North Korea summit he had canceled, is back on. Joining us now, National Review's Jonah Goldberg, a Fox News contributor and author of the new book, Suicide of the West. Jonah, I think the coverage of the summit being back on has been pretty straightforward, whereas the cancellation was depicted as Trump throwing a tantrum, Trump being impulsive. Is that because most journalists are actually in favor of this meeting?
Probably. I think most journalists, to the extent we can generalize that the mainstream media is liberal, which is probably not a dangerous thing to generalize about, there is a general view that they're terrified of someone like John Bolton. They're terrified that Donald Trump would be too eager to go to war, which I don't think is actually justified by his record on these issues. And so the idea of trying diplomacy fits within their ideological wheelhouse, and it's better than all the other alternatives. And so I think there's a general desire to see it happen. I also think Donald Trump has been, in his typical way, kind of brilliant in staging this as this unfolding reality show drama.
Every day, twists and turns.
And so
the letter is delivered to the White House.
And the press loves that stuff.
Yeah.
And they eat it up.
And the press want to go to Singapore and cover this thing.
Exactly, yeah.
But in the second day pieces, there's starting to be a lot of skepticism. Washington Post headline, for example, critics worry Trump is already handing propaganda victories to North Korea. In other words, after this earlier speculation that it was Trump that wanted this summit too much, now it's like, well, just by going, he is elevating Kim Jong-un on the world stage.
Yeah, look, to be honest, I think a lot of that is fair. I'm just not sure I care that much.
Who cares as long as they have serious negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, look, to this extent, look, I personally think, I'm on record, I think it is, I will take all betters. There's no way that North Korea actually denuclearizes in the way that the Trump administration refers to denuclearization. Right. North Korea has their own interesting definition of that. But given how we've gone through normal diplomatic channels and procedures and niceties and protocols for the last 30 years, and we've been taken to the cleaners, if we can go a different route and shake them up and catch them off guard and get some real concessions, that's fine. I'm just very skeptical it'll happen.
And the president with reporters has been lowering expectations. This is probably the first of a number of meetings. All right, so the pardon issue. President this week pardoning Dinesh D'Souza, conservative commentator and provocateur who had pleaded guilty to using straw donors to make illegal campaign contributions 4 years ago. He'd served some time in a community facility. The court rejected his argument that he'd been singled out for political prosecution by the Obama administration. Before I ask you your take, let's typical reaction here from MSNBC's Chris Matthews.
Trump sending a message loud and clear to other pals like Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort, and Michael Cohen. He's staying strong, and there's a pardon for you if you stay strong.
So it's not about D'Souza, it's about signaling to other people in the Russia investigation.
Yeah, look, I've known Dinesh for a couple decades. I think, as you call it, his provocateur role is not one that I endorse. I don't like the way, the course Dinesh has taken. I also do think he was signaled out unjustly for prosecution. And I also think that the way, but he never applied for a pardon. There was no petition of the White House.
It's a normal Justice Department procedure, as people should know.
Donald Trump saw something on TV and said, I'm going to pardon that guy. I don't think, and so I do think it at least lends itself to the appearance that he has got motives other than correcting an unjust act.
And could the same apply, Jonah, to, President publicly said, I might pardon Martha Stewart. Now, she's already served her time. She went to jail for insider trading. I might commute the sentence of Rod Blagojevich, the former Illinois governor. Blago is just amazing. He's still in prison for lots of corruption charges, including selling Barack Obama's Senate seat. So that does tend to make you wonder what the process is here, and is there a wider audience for pardon?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think these are largely political moves. There are lots of people more deserving of pardons than all of these people.
More deserving than Martha Stewart.
Yeah, well, actually, Martha Stewart, I think you can make a pretty good case on the merits. I don't think you could have Blago. Scooter Libby, I thought, deserved a pardon. But you can do the right thing for the wrong reasons in a lot of cases. And I think that's one of the things that the coverage gets skewed by, is because I do think there is a political agenda to all of this. The Joe Arpaio pardon, I think, was utterly indefensible. Joe Arpaio was a bad guy who did bad things.
The former Arizona sheriff.
Yeah, but you can also do the right thing for the wrong reasons, or you can allow yourself to do the right thing for reasons that you just think are politically to your benefit.
Yeah. By the way, Suicide of the West is a very provocative book, and I congratulate you on its early success.
Thank you very much.
All right, after the break, the tabloids have a field day as Kim Kardashian visits the White House, but a CNN correspondent, this is the meaning. Plus, haven't we had enough spectrum reform and seek clemency for a great-grandmother, a first-time drug offender serving a long sentence? Here's the New York Post. The other big-ass summit featuring Kim Jong-un, Trump meets Rump. Then there's the Daily News competing, the only Kim he could get. That's before the other North Korea thing. I'm sure you get that. And you know who didn't approve? CNN's White House correspondent, Jim Acosta.
Forget about the fact that Kim Kardashian is here at the White House today and what planet that is anything resembling normal, because it's not. She shouldn't be here talking about prison reform.
Okay, so the New York Post cover was sexist. And by the way, you guys did such a good job of bringing you back. Jim Acosta is morally offended by this because she's a celebrity. Did he forget that during Obama's term, Jay-Z, Rihanna, Zach Galifianakis, a lot of celebs getting through that White House?
No, it's hilarious for someone who's going on this rant about normalcy. I mean, this was pretty normal, but what's abnormal is to have the chief White House correspondent going after a president's decision in a way that's critical rather than just reporting the facts of what's happening.
I love Acosta saying she should not be here. Like, they didn't check with me on this, Richard. But, you know, of course the media go nuts over Kim Kardashian, but she's using her celebrity to push an issue, which what a lot of celebs do.
And here's the thing, it's a responsible thing for a celebrity to do, and I give her credit for using her power to help free a grandmother who is in jail for a very silly crime. And so I applaud her.
It's a serious crime. She's been in jail for years and years and years.
And so I applaud her for it. And I think, you know, hopefully President Trump, since he's in the pardoning mood, will pardon this grandmother.
All right. So we have a consensus here. This panel is very pro-Kardashian.
Absolutely.
At least for today.
Absolutely.
Now, this other story I actually think is more serious. So Melania Trump, as everyone knows, has been recovering from surgery. She has not been seen in public for about 3 weeks. Endless stories about this. Let's put up a Politico headline. White House silence on Melania stokes conspiracy theories. Among those theories, Emily, she's secretly moved to New York. She's cooperating with Bob Mueller. Why even go there? Why even mention conspiracy theories?
I don't know. And I think this is a sort of a legitimate back and forth in some ways because there were some serious unanswered questions. You know, the stay in her stay in the hospital compared to what would be normal for the procedure. Legitimate question.
You don't think the White House put up enough information about the First Lady's condition?
I think it's fair for reporters to wonder. I don't think it's fair for the speculation to get as crazy as it's gotten.
Right. And it reached a point, Richard, where the First Lady had to tweet, media working overtime speculating about where I am, what I'm doing, so she's feeling great. But it's almost like the press is insulted that she's not doing anything in front of the cameras.
And here's the reason why. I think the reason why the press might be insulted is the fact that Melania is not doing more, because she's one of the most popular figures in this White House, and she's emerged to be popular with both Democrats and Republicans. So when she's a missing fixture, people are like, "Where's Melania?" But to some extent, I think
she doesn't love the spotlight.
No, she doesn't, and I think
it's her choice.
It's absolutely her choice, and I think, as we all know, there's two different types of first ladies. There are first ladies that are very active in their presidencies, and there's other first ladies who's like, "My job is to be the first lady. My job is also to be a wife and very much in the background," and that's the role that Melania chooses to have. It seems as though the media just wants more Melania.
That is true. So how nuts will everyone go when she does a public event?
Yeah, it's going to be completely
nuts. Frenzy.
But you know, I think it's also just that her press team has been really interesting the way they've handled this. They've sort of thrown back, you know, Donald Trump level things. You know, they're having a lot of fun with it almost.
All right, this time we're going to give you the rest of the day off. Richard Fowler, Emily Jasinski, still to come. Devastating new information about the Puerto Rican hurricane, and it barely makes the media radar. And